Good morning, Internet students. Welcome to class with Professor Mead. Today we're going to talk about physical abuse of children. You may not have, or you may have noticed before, that's Pasha. She's laying on the concrete. I think I mentioned it before in this class, but what you're seeing is that I have no floors. We haven't had floors for about a year. We're remodeling our house. If you think that I might be a bad dog owner and she doesn't have a bed, she has a bed in the front patio, one in the living room, and one upstairs. She's choosing to lay on the concrete instead. Take two because a helicopter flew over. So let's talk about the ThinkPair share. Uh, Paradigms for defining abuse, causes of physical abuse, risk factors for physical abuse, protective factors for physical abuse, and some tasks that parents who tend to be abusive haven't learned, and then talk about briefly what Munchausen syndrome is and Munchausen syndrome by proxy. I can guarantee you've heard the term before, even if you can't at the moment think about what the definition is. Take a moment to pause it, practice, and see if you know these answers before the lecture. Okay, so when we talk about causes of abuse from a medical and academic model, they often use what we call a three-category framework in order to understand causes of abuse and understand how environmental life variables can impact individuals and families, and how social, cultural, economic variables can impact individuals and families, creating stressors that can lead to physical abuse. So this three-category framework is microsystem, mesosystem, macrosystem. So a microsystem is you, your biology, who you are, your socialization, right? Your behaviors, your actions, your feelings, your thought, right? Any issues that you may have physically or mentally. Specifically when we talk about children and seniors, because those are vulnerable populations, the microsystem that can be increase your risk of physical abuse is that you have a physical disability or a mental disability. And so children and adults who have physical and mental disabilities are more likely to be abused by caregivers because of the additional stress that may create. A mesosystem, sometimes called an exosystem, is those first primary groups, right? Your immediate family, the people that you play with in school, childcare centers, in your neighborhood, right? Your first reference groups, your family and very first friends. That is your mesosystem. So those people, right? The dynamics of the family, their abilities to cope with stress, the dynamics of the neighborhood and that ability and influence, macrosystem influences on them that can create stress, can increase or decrease the likelihood that you might be physically abused. The next one is a macro system. So we're talking about, they say customs here, but we're talking about norms, values, and mores. So norms, values, and mores. So norms are the everyday interactions, right? And how you're expected to act within society. So those norms can either increase your likelihood of abuse or decrease your likelihood of abuse. If hitting or screaming or punching is part of a norm in a society, then you're more likely to be hit, screamed at, or punched. Values, that's that moderate one, right? So that's more stringent than an everyday interaction norm, but not so much into a law like a more. So that's the values the society holds. You should be strong. You should be independent, you should be wealthy. Those are some typical values that we have in our society, right? And so those can increase or decrease your likelihood of abuse. And then of course mores, in this case we're calling them laws, right? How do laws increase or decrease your likelihood of abuse? Well, laws and policies significantly impact your exosystem, right? That mesosystem. It impacts communities. Some communities, like we've learned, are more likely to be policed, and therefore you can be physically abused by people within the community, or even by the people within the system who are supposed to be protecting you. You can also encounter situations where the laws and the values are less likely to protect you if you're being physically abused. Think of, like, historically our laws for spousal abuse have been to just let families deal with it themselves. And so we take a standoff approach to abuse of children and women until it gets very extreme. So that's an impact of how laws and values also can impact your meso and micro systems. A good example, if you want to think back historically, the rule of thumb is means, like, if you stick out your thumb, you were allowed to beat your wife as long as what you beat her with, the stick that you beat her with, was smaller than your thumb. If it was bigger than that, then you were in violation of the law. But if it was smaller, you were not in violation of the law. So risk and protective factors, right? So there are both risk factors and protective factors that vary for everybody on a microsystem. I mentioned one earlier where you can increase your risk by personally having a physical disability, but you can also have an increased risk. There's also a strong correlation between your risk of abuse and your age. The likelihood of being physically abused is the most extreme in the very young and the very old. So people who are a bit older, teenagers, people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, are much less likely to be physically abused than people who are under 10 and over 70 or 80 or 90 years old. Attachment, or specifically attachment disorders, can cause issues with increasing risk. So your level of attachment to your family, your parents specifically, can, if you have a high level of attachment to your parent and your family, that decreases your likelihood of physical abuse within your family. But this isn't just the case for moms and children, right? This is also the community. So the more linked we are or attached we are in our community, the less likely we are to be physically abused. This goes back to Durkheim's theory of anomie and his research on suicide. The people who are most likely to commit suicide, according to Durkheim in his theories, are the ones with the highest level of anomie, also called normlessness. And that means that they are the least connected to their community, the lowest levels of attachment to their community. So they're not involved in community, neighborhoods, friends, with churches or synagogues or other organization that connects them and attaches them into their community. Those people, known as WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant males specifically, tend to be the least attached to their community, and therefore the most attached or the most likely to commit suicide. So the same line of logic applies here. The more attached you are to family, friends, and community, the more protective factors you have against physical and mental abuse, because you have many people assisting in raising children. On a very practical level, think about it this way. If you put a parent in isolation with a colicky child with zero help and zero attachment to anybody within the community, you're going to increase the likelihood that that person will get so stressed out that they may possibly physically abuse that baby by doing something like shaking them in the middle of the night while they're exhausted and not thinking straight. If you have an additional caregiver, spouse, family, parents in there helping you, whether your child is ill or not, right? It decreases the likelihood of physical abuse because it decreases the likelihood of stress. And then what we do know about some of the parental risk factors, right? So is that we know that in the research there's kind of this dual line of thinking, and it's basically a discrepancy. So historically, it was really truly believed that the less money that you had, the more likely you were to abuse your children. In other words, wealthy people were less likely to physically abuse their children than poor people. But what we know today is that wealthy people tend to have less social capital, meaning less attachment to their community. And people without financial resources, poor people, tend to have a higher social capital in the United States, and therefore more attachment to their community. So they're more likely to be interdependent with friends, family, and community, which lowers the risk factor. Okay, so we've essentially already talked about this, but let's go into a little bit more detail. Let's kind of organize it. So some of the risk and protective factors. Family, extended family, community. The more involved you are with parents, the less likely they are to abuse. The more access you have to resources, both social and financial resources to help you when you're going through stressors in life, the better you are able to cope with those stressors, and therefore the lower risk of abuse for people who are vulnerable in those populations. We know that social capital and socioeconomic status both play a role in your risk factor or protective factor of abuse. It's social networks and social integration into your community is a protective factor, right? The more you're connected to your community, the more a community works together to raise children, the less likely that children are going to be abused or neglected. This is true across all cultures and over time, right? So that I found one that is a source from Prevent Child Abuse in America, and they're using this meso-exo system, and they're talking about some of the basics of protective factors. Parental resilience, that's your ability to cope with problems. Social connections, that's social capital. Concrete support in times of need, so that can be both organized social capital. If you know how to access the bureaucratic systems to get help, that's a skill that you have. That skill is a type of capital, right? It's skills, and sharing those skills are a form of social capital. So being able to access that concrete support when you need it, having that skill reduces the chances that your family and yourself will experience levels of abuse or crisis. Knowledge of parenting and child development, social and emotional competence of children. That's what we were talking about in terms of increasing chances of abuse if you have a physical or emotional or mental disability. But that also means that there are things, in parenting styles that we can do that can actually decrease or increase our ability, the likelihood of abuse. One of the examples that I think of often is, the lack of teaching children to manage their own emotions. We talked a little bit about care work, right? Being able to manage your emotions while helping someone else manage their emotions, right? And so we know this is very clear with a toddler. They don't really know how to manage their emotions, express their needs, and their problems, right? And so they're still learning how to calmly and reasonably manage their emotions, right? If I'm upset, I can cry, and then I can calm myself, and then I can ask for what I need or I want. And we've all met adults who can't do this. So this is emotional competence, right? If you grow into adulthood and you've never practiced at or been taught how to manage your own emotions, you are going to create emotional crisis everywhere in your life, even when the other factors don't necessarily suggest that that's the appropriate response. So some of the tasks parents have not learned basically reiterate some of the things we already talked about. Being able to manage your emotions and emotional well-being is essentially to get their needs met in an appropriate way, right? If you know how to manage your emotional well-being and you know how to express your needs, you're going to do so in an appropriate way. How to separate your feelings from your actions. You can be stressed and angry, but that doesn't mean you have to scream or yell. Or if you are yelling, is there a valid reason why? Are you doing so to accomplish something quickly, like yelling to get a child's attention because they're running in front of a car, right? Not necessarily because you're angry, right? The separating emotions or feelings from actions, one of the things that I know I did and still do is if I get scared, right, with my child, like if my child were to run in front of a car, I would get scared and scream, right? So I know that for me, I feel as though that's an appropriate response, but I can't necessarily separate always that action. Whereas I never really screamed at my children even when I was upset with them. So in that way, I did very much separate my feelings from my actions. You can discipline without being angry. Parents, when they discipline, regardless of how they do it, if they separate their personal feelings from this is an action of discipline, um, then they're more likely to be less abusive and to teach their children also this ability. How to make decisions. So being able to, deductively reason, to make logical decisions, to apply those decisions to their life and to create continuity. Those are the things that are not learned in families that are often abusive. And then, of course, it seems like I have doubled it up and it says separate feelings from actions. Again, I guess that was important. Okay, here's our review. Paradigms for defining abuse, some causes of physical abuse, risk factors, protective factors, tasks parents have not learned. Oh, Munchausen syndrome and Munchausen syndrome by proxy we're going to talk about in videos for the activity. But just a quick rundown, Munchausen syndrome is when you hurt yourself or make yourself ill so that you can get attention. Usually it's medical attention. Munchausen syndrome by proxy is when you do it to someone else. Often that's a person who's in a vulnerable population, young children, older adults. And this is your reluctant YouTube professor signing off. Have a great day.